Good morning, everyone. Thanks for being here. It's my pleasure to introduce Sally Haslanger from MIT as a keynote speaker of this ninth SEFA conference. She will talk about conceptual amelioration, epistemic, and semantic. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. It's a great honor to be here and a great pleasure as well. So I'm going to just dive in, but there is a handout. Make sure you have one. The way I do talks is that I read a lot of it, have a few visual images along the way. I think this is important for accessibility purposes because not everybody is equally good at processing information just spoken to them. And I like to have multiple modes of presentation. And also I recognize that English is the dominant language of academic life, and I think that's a problem, and I want to sort of make sure that the fact that you're not a native English speaker should not prevent you from processing the information, and it's often easier to do it when you're getting it in a text. It also is something you can take home with you as a party favor. Okay, so let's get going. In my recent work, I've argued that, I should go through the outline first, I'm sorry. How do I do this? Okay, here's our outline. I'm going to have a little bit of an introduction. I'm going to situate the discussion in the political context. I'm going to then present one approach to concepts. So this is a kind of somewhat radical semantic externalist view, sort of drawing on Bob Stolnicher's work. I'm then going to talk about different forms of amelioration and how we might think about that in this sort of semantic externalism. Then there's going to be a problem that perhaps contents are essential to concepts, and so we won't be able to ameliorate, and I'm going to address that by looking particularly at the function of concepts within systems, within conceptual systems, and then I'll draw a conclusion. Okay, so here's the introduction. Excuse me, I have a long-standing cough, and it's worse in the mornings, unfortunately. So in my recent work, I've argued that to understand the phenomenon of oppression, we need to better understand human embeddedness in social practices. So social practices are a site of socially organized agency in response to a resource, where I take resources to be things of plus or minus value. So notice that when you came in this morning, I would guess that none of you deliberated about whether you were going to sit up here. You all just automatically, so to speak, went and sat in your places there and turned off your cell phone and took out your notebooks or whatever. That's a social practice. We're engaged in a social practice of an academic talk right now, and we become fluent in this particular kind of social practice because we've been brought up in it since childhood and as part of academic life. So just as an example of a social practice, and it's a socially organized agency in response to the resource. So the resource in this case, I would hope, would be knowledge, but maybe it's just airtime, right? So I get a lot of the airtime, and you don't get much of the airtime until later. But hopefully also it's, in the ideal cases anyway, in academic life, it's distributing a resource which is knowledge. Okay, so these practices depend on there being public schemas or social meanings that we rely on for communication and signaling. So the big desk up here, the PowerPoint, all of this, these are signals that you pick up on the minute you walk in the room, and they guide your agency. Culture, or what I've called a cultural techne, provides a toolbox of scripts, meanings, background default assumptions, etc., that are constantly being altered, repurposed, discarded, and contested. So I want to include in cultural techne a variety of different things. I'm not specifying precisely what they are because I think it will depend on people who work in psychology and cultural studies, etc., to help us understand the full range of things. But I have in mind things like pink means girl and blue means boy, kind of simple meanings of that kind, but also marriages between one man and one woman. That's a background default assumption, or it used to be, and other kinds of scripts, like first comes love, then comes marriage, then comes baby in the baby carriage. In the United States, that's one of those jump rope songs that you do. Anyway, it's very common, and it's a script. So it will include a variety of different things. So a cultural techne is a mechanism for the distribution of power and resources, and our options for agency are limited by what symbolic and material resources local practices make available. So there are times when we try to communicate something to someone with our clothing or with our body style or with our gestures. And if the social meaning isn't available that is public and something that enables us to interpret you as intelligible, then your agency is frustrated. So hegemonic social practices become part of the local geography, a given around which we structure our lives. So the given of this distribution of seats and such, it becomes just part of the geography. And I think that these cultural technes have a dimension of them that is material. So that's a part I won't talk about today. Some individuals live in inhospitable social terrain, other in fertile valleys. If they have many resources to communicate and articulate, so to speak, their agency, then that will be a very hospitable terrain. But notice that the articulation is not always verbal. It's enacted, embodied. Taking social practices to be the core social phenomenon allows us to do justice to a neo-materialist commitment to remain theoretically grounded in social relations, including both their material and cultural conditions. So I'm thinking neo-materialism here, drawing on Iris Young. So as we know, there's a caricature of Marx, where Marx thinks that the driving force of history is the economic domain, and that really all of culture is epiphenomenal. And the more contemporary views of materialism, and some people think a better interpretation of Marx, is that there's an interdependence between the economic and the cultural. And actually, it's going to be many, on my view, there are these many determinants of meaning and determinants of action, including geographical, biological, physical, all of those. So when we eat, the food you eat, it's partly determined by economic considerations, what you can afford, what is available, by geographic, where you live, by physical, because what your body can process, but also semantic. So the things that you eat have meaning. So for example, at a wedding reception, you're not going to order McDonald's for the guests, probably because that has a meaning that it's not a very important event, unless you're President of the United States and you invite people to have Burger King, when you celebrate them at the White House. So, and then we laugh because we understand the meaning of Burger King. And so food has social meaning, and that's a part of the conditions of that determines our agency and action. Not determines in the sense of, I don't mean determines, conditions, let's say. Okay, so in response to oppression or injustice, we must collectively change the existing social structures, and this requires more than thinking differently. But today I'll focus on the project of challenging a cultural techne, specifically the conceptual and symbolic tools it affords. One way of doing this is through conceptual amelioration. Recently, I've argued that one form of conceptual amelioration is epistemic and the other is semantic. And today I'll review this distinction and argue that at least one form of semantic amelioration, that is, amelioration on functional grounds, is coherent and sometimes valuable. Okay, so how should we understand social change? Much social change is triggered by natural disasters, wars, migration, technological advances, economic booms and busts, but some occurs because the conceptual or symbolic frame for coordination changes. In any case, material and cultural change goes hand in hand. What does the process of cultural change, a change in symbolic and conceptual resources, involve? What are we doing when we come to understand that race is not a biological kind, but a social construct? Do we change what it is to be married when we recognize same-sex marriage? Have we replaced our old concept of marriage or race with a new one, or has our understanding of marriage or race simply evolved? In the context of political activism, it can be important to insist that we're not simply undermining old practices and replacing them with new ones. For example, in the movement for marriage equality, Same-sex marriages are marriages as legitimate as any ever were. So part of the worry is that when you say, oh, we've just introduced a new concept of marriage, we've replaced the old one with a new one, then people have a resistance to that. They say, no, this isn't really marriage, this is just pseudo-marriage or something like that. And so rhetorically, at least, it can be important to say, no, this is marriage. It's not something else that we just are calling marriage. We should also interpret history as continuous with our current conditions. Race has been constructed over centuries with cultural tools that deflected attention from social reality, and this is still happening today. So in the context of discussions about race, there are a lot of people who think that race is a bogus concept. It means, some kind of biological distinction between people that's not real, so we should just get rid of it. But others think, no, racialization has been happening over centuries, and it is a real process. And to just pretend that it's not, that it was an illusion all along, somehow undermines our ability to really take seriously what race is. Okay, so critique depends on a kind of genealogy that situates us in history, and social change is a process of evolution. Resistance to this way of understanding change is a political issue and is a way of contesting movements for social change. So a lot of times you will hear people, complain that progressives, it's just PC culture trying to tell us how we should talk, et cetera, et cetera. But instead, I think that we need to situate our work on cultural change within this kind of genealogical story and historical story about our concepts and how they work and how they're embedded in our social practices. It's sometimes difficult, however, to defend the idea that we're not simply discarding our old ways and imposing something new. That's what the people who think it's all just PC, they think we're just imposing our new language on them. And it's hard to find resources in contemporary philosophy to aid in the defense. If it is part of what marriage means, that it is between one man and one woman, then it would seem that same-sex marriage does involve a replacement of our concept of marriage. And there are philosophers who've argued this in court, that marriage means, it's analytic of marriage, that it's between one man and one woman. I don't believe in analytic truths, I'm Aquinian about this, but I think that there are dangers in analytic philosophy that we support the status quo in ways that I think are problematic. So this would be, we've destroyed marriage and replaced it with something we pretend is marriage. Or because race isn't biological, it isn't real, because nothing social could be race, so we should stop thinking in racial terms. I want to ask, can we avoid this within a philosophically viable account of concepts? Okay, so now I'm going to talk about one approach to concepts. So some of this, at the very beginning, may be a bit of a review for some people, but I'm going to be developing it a bit. So I'm going to work with an externalist framework, a Stolnikerian framework. So in this approach, we express, believe, and suppose propositions. Propositions should be understood in terms of informational or intentional content, as truth conditions, propositions as functions from possible circumstances to truth values, or equivalently as sets of possible situations. Okay, so here's informational content of a concept as a partition of logical space. For our purposes, the informational content of a concept is a partition of possible individuals. Strictly speaking, it's going to have to be, I'll get this. So how do we understand concepts on this view? Let's start with the idea that the informational content of a concept is a partition of possible individuals. Our partition of possible dogs is just all the actual and possible dogs, or more precisely, a function from world-time pairs to sets of individuals. The furry, slobbery, barky ones in our lives, plus the ones that have existed, will exist, and ones we only imagine. So I'm not thinking that these are abstract entities. These are very much not abstract entities. They're like this. And you might think of our world as sort of situated in here, and these are our dogs, but they're far reaches of the dog logical space, and then this is all everything else. Okay, we have access to content through different modalities, from different vantage points, and at different levels of granularity. So roughly, for an individual to possess a concept, possess in the most minimal sense, a concept of X is to have a cluster of capabilities that enables them to process information about X's. So here you have a vet and a child, and they are able to have a set of capacities that enable them to roughly draw this distinction, but for, in better and more complete and less complete ways. So, the child may not be able to do it for all, may encounter a Saint Bernard and not know what it is because the child is small and they've only known small dogs. So this might be, but they basically have a capacity to process information about X's. So possessing a concept is a matter of having dispositions toward a space of possibilia. Possessing a concept is not like owning a car. It isn't having a mental particular in one's head. It is like possessing a skill. Okay, so it's not like mental representation. So in the kind of externalist framework we're talking about, they're not mental particulars, which are your concepts. It's a skill, a set of dispositions. From a psychological point of view, possession of the concept may occur by virtue of different cognitive mechanisms and give rise to different dispositions in different individuals. Possession, like skill, comes in different forms and degrees. We may share the concept of X, so the vet and the child both share the concept of X. We both have the capacities to process information about X's, but we differ in how refined or idiosyncratic our capacities are. Let's say that different individuals who share the concept of X form different conceptions of X. So you have the shared concept because of the shared capacities, roughly shared capacities to process information about dogs. But the child and the vet have different conceptions of X. And in fact, you and I have different conceptions of X because conceptions are very idiosyncratic in how I'm using the word. Sharing concepts, however, is crucial for communication and coordination. Concepts marshal and organize our capacities for attention, categorization, interpretation, memory, language, inference, affect, and the like, for coordinating with others in response to particular kinds of information. So this role for concepts requires a kind of standardization of what counts as an adequate appreciation of X's for the purposes at hand. Okay, so this requires standardization of what counts, not just possessing the concept, but being conversant. To be conversant with the concept of X in a context C, one must be able to process a subset of information about X's that is socially approved. So remember Putnam. So Putnam would talk about a stereotype. So around here, so to speak, in order to know what a tiger is, you have to know that tigers are striped. And so there's going to be a set of cultural background assumptions that are going to play a role in your thinking about tigers so that you can be conversant for the purposes at hand. And he had this idea about beeches and elms. We know very little about beeches and elms, just so you need to know that's an elm and that's a beech. I wouldn't have known if I hadn't looked it up. That most of us don't have to know, to be able to identify from the leaf the difference between a beech and an elm, to be sufficiently conversant in ordinary contexts about beeches and elms. Okay, so those who are conversant with a concept and a context have an approved orientation that privileges certain exemplars, features, responsive, both affective and cognitive, experiences, inferences, and subcategories. So a vet and a child may both possess the same concept of dog, but the vet can take the orientation of veterinary medicine and will be conversant with dog in contexts that call for that orientation. So they both share this concept, but whoops, I went too fast. But it might be, here you have partitions of this logical space, and the child may be only familiar with these, where the vet with those, and so the vet is going to be conversant with dog in a context that calls for that orientation, more sophisticated in her capacities to draw distinctions that the child can't draw. Okay. We sometimes introduce different words to pick out the same partition of logical space. So vets might use the term canis familiaris in certain contexts, reflecting the context of inquiry, where the child wouldn't know what a canis familiaris is, would only have the word dog. So sometimes these different words are reflective of the different contexts and orientations that are appropriate. So Yalson considers, this is Seth Yalson, considers water and H2O, and he says, for example, the former water concept might, inter alia, be understood as embedding the partition into a subject matter reflecting parochial human interests and concerns, one including, say, the subject matter beverages, so that with the concept water, we inter alia locate the stuff amongst the beverages. Now, I think that's a bit weird because, water comes as ice too and steam too. So we're just thinking it's water within a certain temperature range falls within the beverages. While the latter, H2O, embeds it in some part of the subject matter of chemistry, so that with the concept H2O, we inter alia locate the stuff amongst the chemicals. So here, H2O is being located here, and water is locating it here. And they're coextensive, but there can be possibilities when we may have to shift and these two come apart. Okay, so the subject matter in this context is plausibly delimited by a set of questions that arise in inquiry, but also in relation to our practical concerns. So if we want to rely on reify an orientation, because that's what I'm talking about, is what are these orientations that the vet has and the child has, it might be thought of as a temporally extended abstract particular that is the evolving cluster of socially approved responses to a privileged subset of information. So I'm thinking about it as you might imagine a ritual. A ritual is going to be, you could sort of think of it as an abstract particular that evolves over time, and it's a kind of sequences of apt responses to the phenomena. So a ritual is a set of behaviors and responses. It evolves over time. It has certain symbolic meanings that are involved in it. And so when we think of as an orientation, it's going to be something quite like that. The veterinary orientation privileges the distinction between sick and healthy non-human animals and requires epistemic and effective responses that guide the exercise of agency. Fluency in an orientation can also involve being conversant with a broad range of signaling mechanisms and social meanings employed in the context. So the concept pink has the color pink as its informational content, but to be conversant with pink in some contemporary context requires responses linked to femininity, the use of feminine pronouns, etc. So pink is going to be just a partition of logical space of pink things, world time pairs, blah, 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 to make it precise. But in order to be conversant with pink in a local context, you have to have certain affective and behavioral responses to pink. You have to know that when you see pink, you use a feminine pronoun when it's an infant and things like this. So my focus is going to be on concepts understood as a public resource for coordination, and so on orientations rather than individual conceptions. So to some extent, I'm going to be talking about the general concept and the possession and the minimal sense of the concept, but I'm also going to be talking about orientations, which are more fine-grained. So you have concept, orientations, and then conceptions. And orientations are these kind of the set of socially approved dispositions we have to the partition of logical space. So going back to this picture, maybe that's, so the child and the vet, so this is the content, but there's going to be different orientations, the childish orientation toward this partition of logical space, and the veterinary orientation toward this partition of logical space. And they're going to guide their behavior differently. Their behavior in response to actual and possible dogs will be different. And what's interesting is that they're going to be able to pick up information about these dogs. So if one of them has a broken leg or has some kind of disease, the vet will be attentive to that, attentive to the actual and possible dogs that have that kind of condition. And so that will be part of the veterinary orientation to that area of logical space where the child won't. Okay. Forms of conceptual amelioration. So we can now distinguish some different forms of amelioration. Let's think a bit about disorientation. Suppose I'm looking for a coffee shop in a foreign city, and I use Google Maps. I'm directed to a shop that's not what I expected, and I'm disoriented, right? So I'm expecting a cafe, and Google Maps sends me to a truck randomly situated on some pavement, I guess. Is the app faulty, or is this a new kind of coffee shop that I hadn't before imagined? Note that ordinary disorientation can occur either because the resources one brings to a situation are inadequate for navigating the space, or because the space you assume you're navigating isn't the space you need to navigate. So in Amsterdam, a coffee shop is a weed shop, right? So here you are, you could be disoriented because you're at a coffee shop, but you don't recognize it as such, coffee shop in the sense you intended, or you're at a coffee shop that's not the sense of coffee shop that you intended. So there's these different ways of being disoriented. Similarly, there are two dimensions along which we might evaluate and so adjust our conceptual resources. If our orientation is faulty, we're disoriented. It might be because our orientation is not adequately tracking the phenomenon. We're missing something, so the child might be missing something about the dog world, or it is wrong about what the phenomenon to be tracked is. And orientation can be adjusted and not just replaced either way. So the first one is the epistemic amelioration. So I would think it's in the case where you come across the truck with a coffee shop in the back of it, and you're just having to learn, oh, this is a coffee shop too. So in the context of epistemic amelioration, we improve our understanding of the informational content. In the cases I'm interested in, this involves certain kinds of changes in our orientation, changes that expand or contract what part of the content our orientation highlights. So remember, when we went back to the logical space, so the child had an orientation toward a rather restricted range of the partition of logical space, or only some features across all of that, where the vet had a much more fine-grained and sophisticated appreciation of many more details in that. And so when you're confronted with something confusing, sometimes what you need to do is look more closely at the items in that partition of logical space and learn more about them. So in the epistemic amelioration, I already mentioned, and there are two different kinds. Refinement, typically we don't have a very solid grasp of the informational content of our concepts. There may be gaps in our judgment about cases. Our orientation may leave out important factors. By gaining empirical knowledge, undertaking conceptual genealogy, or insight into logical space at a more fine-grained resolution, we can refine what responses are apt based on a broader or deeper knowledge of the phenomenon. For example, we may discover that poverty takes different forms depending on age, gender, geographical location, culture, and so access the phenomenon of poverty at a finer grain of resolution. So this might be, for example, as we do science, we learn that water is H2O, and that's a refinement of our understanding of water. We might also gain epistemically ameliorate, so to speak, learn more about the concept through experiential access. We improve our access to the informational content through different modes of presentation. Our first-person experience of poverty may demonstrate that our political orientation and effective responses toward poverty is inadequate. And in this context, I was thinking about water, and so we learn, water is H2O through empirical research. We also learn that water can be snow and what that feels like, and that water can hurt, so to speak, when you don't have enough clothing on, when you're snowed upon or something. That would be experiential. Am I running out of time? 9:38, okay. So there's also informational or semantic amelioration. We change the informational content or the partition of logical space of the concept to do better. So how do we do this? Well, the alethic, we improve the resources available to track truths For example, we might discover that race is a socio-historical kind. And so we might want to discover that so if you think that race doesn't exist, then there's no such thing as whites. But if you think of it as a socio-historical kind, then suddenly we're able to include in the partition people that we weren't including before. And so the fact that we didn't before, in this case, it prevented us from noticing important truths and from being aptly responsive to certain kinds of injustice, shifting the informational content so social truths become articulable using the term race can unmask ideology and shine a light on emancipatory possibilities. Also, we can improve our terms of coordination. So lunch once picked out a light meal at any time of day or night. By narrowing the possibilities for lunch, we more efficiently convey information about when we intend to meet. In the moral, I didn't include moral on the slide, I don't know why. That's weird, but okay. Because what we mean can affect what we do, and this affects what there is in the world, a semantic amelioration can also be broadly moral. We have moral reasons to make it possible for there to be legal same-sex marriages. This was not possible before. So the idea is that we have this line, and we think, oh, maybe this is what race meant, and what we have to do is adjust, so here's okay, let me go back. I'm being confusing here. Okay, so this distinction between whites and non-whites, we might even say that there's nothing in each of them if you don't want it, or you could say that everything is non-white. And then we have to say, no, we're going to switch and change what the partition of logical space is. This is semantic amelioration. You change what partition of logical space is going to be part of the content of the concept. Okay, but you might ask, how can you do semantic amelioration? Because isn't content essential to a concept? Many people would think that content is essential, but I'm going to argue that it's not. So it's fairly clear how the epistemic amelioration might work, but is semantic amelioration really possible? If informational content is essential to a concept, then semantic amelioration is impossible, and the best we could hope for is concept replacement. Concept replacement is compatible with retaining the word for a new content, so replacement could be masked, but can the content of a concept change while it remains the same concept? This goes back to the question of, is marriage, have we just replaced old marriage with new marriage? And so the people who say, oh, we're just being PC, we're pretending that we're keeping marriage, but really we've destroyed marriage and introduced this new thing, marriage star, and don't make me use my language, of marriage to talk about marriage star. So that's the question. Are we really here in this possibility talking about the same concept that evolves, or are we just replacing it? Recall that concepts are to be understood as a cluster of dispositions toward a partition of logical space. The dispositions included in a perspective are not random, included in an orientation are not random. They should be dispositions that are apt for the content, and they should be apt for the function they serve in coordination. For example, suppose that we succeed in fixing the referent of meter using a stick. Let's say the stick that happens to be exactly 39 inches long. But using a particular physical object as the standard is a nuisance because it doesn't achieve the uniformity of measure that is required. It's reasonable then to correct ourselves and at the same time correct the content of meter. We might find, for example, there's a distinctive physical phenomenon that is close in length to 39, say 39.3701, and change the length of a meter to that. So the stick in Paris, right, depending on the circumstances and et cetera, it changes its length because of temperature, et cetera. Also, it's really hard to get it to be exactly the one in China and exactly the one in these other places because they might vary slightly in their length. So we need to have some kind of fixed what they have is sort of a percentage of the circumference of the globe or something like that. And so we changed the length of a meter to that. In changing the length, are we abandoning the concept meter and introducing a new concept meter star? I think we're not. The initial length fix didn't work for us, and the second did. So this is a pragmatic change in the content of the term meter. It's not a replacement, I think. So concepts are not simply cognitive placeholders for content. This is going to be really important. Concepts are associated with content. They're the dispositions that we have for processing information about content, but they're not cognitive placeholders for content. They provide orientations toward content at different levels of granularity, highlight features of the content in response to questions, situate the content in different subject matters, and mandate a cluster of inferential and affective responses. So these aspects of concepts should carry weight in our individuation of them. So again, concepts are not these little mental particulars that have the content sort of written on them, right? That's not the conception of content I have in mind. What they are is a set of dispositions to respond to these partitions of logical space. And when we think about what's important about concepts, is those dispositions and how we rely on those dispositions for coordination, for communication, etc., like that. So it's sometimes more important to the individuation of a concept that it be included in the subject matter in which it is situated and embedded in the relevant set of practices. So here we had before the Yolson on water and H2O. So it's more important that it remain connected to the subject matter of, say, beverages or chemicals than it maintain its exact informational content. So if we have, climate change and sort of pollution of water, we may end up drinking beer instead, right? This is what, in the old days, people drank beer instead of water, because water was, not very good for you. They didn't have water filtration systems that were very good, but beer sort of cleaned up the water sufficiently so that you drank beer instead of water. Okay, we may end up doing that in the future. Let's hope. Anyway, sorry, just kidding. And so in that case, we should say that the change of content is compatible with the continuity of the concept, because water needs to stick with beverages. It's part of what we do with water. The subject matter, and I have to say I'm channeling Steve Yablo a little bit here. Subject matter of water, if that is in beverages, then we're going to pull these things apart. The point of introducing concepts is to do justice to the different ways we access content and our different dispositions to respond to content. To ignore these differences in considering the individuation of concepts would be to sacrifice what we have gained. So the whole point of so for the externalist, really the most important thing is the content. But we saw you're going to have to introduce concepts because we aren't just all fully aware of the full everything about that partition of logical space. And this is also connected to the problem of logical omniscience. We are not logically omniscient. So when you talk about the content of your belief, you can't just assume that you have full access to all of the content, all of that partition of logical space. So people like Yolson and Yablo and others have been trying to think about, well, how do you handle some of these problems? And you say, okay, the content is there, but our access to the content is mediated through concepts, which give us access to this content in different sorts of ways. But now that we've introduced this notion of concept, which is doing this other kind of work for us, we ought to allow that work is part of what individuates what concepts are. Now, I'm not going to propose an algorithm to guide us in deciding when and how to ameliorate. I'm doing this on purpose. When we should, semantically ameliorate in particular. I'm not going to tell us when we should do that. These decisions are a matter of judgment, and they need to be sensitive to a broad range of considerations. We encounter them not just as theorists, but as agents engaged in historically specific practices. The question is how we should go on, and there isn't a rule to tell us how. So I'm going to talk about marriage and family and these sorts of things But these are examples, and they are my judgments that are contestable, right? I'm fallible about this. So I think that marriage, for example, was the semantic, the partition of logical space that marriage picked out was between one man and one woman for most of history. And now we're semantically ameliorating to include. But others, and I think that there's plenty of evidence of this given that marriage was a matter of holding property, right? Men held property in women, and there were laws about this, et cetera, et cetera. And it wasn't the friendship marriage, sort of partnering marriage that we now have. That wasn't the history of marriage. It was possible to move to same-sex marriage because you've had an evolution of what we take marriage to be over time. And so we need to semantically ameliorate, to change the partition of logical space that we're now take marriage to have as its content, the term marriage to have as its content, because of this evolution. But that's not giving up what marriage is. So that's my interpretation, but I know very well that people have different interpretations of what's going on. Okay. So, in some cases of amelioration, so functions and systems, in some cases of amelioration, we should look to the function of a concept, that is, the function of the capacities and dispositions in a social context to determine how to proceed. What function does this concept serve? This is different from asking what function does the property associated with the concept serve. The heart functions to pump blood. The concept of the heart doesn't function to pump blood, right? The concept of the heart is different from the heart. The concept of the heart functions to direct our attention to the distinction between hearts and non-hearts. So I'm not talking about functional properties associated with concepts. I'm talking about the function of the concepts, the function of these dispositions we have, the functions of, our capacities, because that's what we rely on in social contexts for communication. So I'm not claiming that we construct concepts with purposes in mind or that concepts have a proper function. Think of this as thinking about Millikan. I'm not going teleosemantics here. I'm relying on a systems conception of function rather than a purposive or ideological conception. So think of a system. So here's a school. And the school is very much a part of an educational system. It is also part of a neighborhood and is also part of a legal and social services system. So for example, in the United States, where we have terrible healthcare provision, the school is a crucial place for the healthcare provision for children because they have a school nurse. And so you can see it as an educational institution, but there are people who see the school as a social services institution because that's where the children contact a nurse who can identify whether they have a disease or an illness or some other health needs, and that hooks the child into the healthcare system. And of course, it's part of a neighborhood system because neighborhood groups often use the school after school to have meetings or, et cetera, et cetera. So this is a systems idea of function. So the school has different functions relative to different systems. Some would say, well, it has this proper function of education. I'm not interested in its proper function. I'm interested in how it functions in these different systems. So according to a systems approach, features of a system, say an engine or a circulatory system, are explained by workings of its subparts, the carburetor or the heart. So the workings of the social services system will depend on the subworkings of the school and the hospital, et cetera, and clinics and all of those sorts of things. We decide on what system and what features of the system we are interested in. The same thing can function differently with respect to different systems, so we consider how the school functions within these different systems. And we need not say that the part has a proper function. So it's a standard project in sociology to consider how social systems maintain social stratification. What are the relevant subparts, housing, jobs, education, healthcare, and how do they function to sustain the hierarchy? So, excuse me, schools do function to sustain social stratification because of the quality of the schools in different neighborhoods, et cetera. So concepts and orientations are part of the cultural techne that keep a social system running. They keep these practices, institutions, and structures running because they focus our attention on features of the world around which we coordinate and call for approved responses. And if the system is flawed, a concept may be the source of the flaw because the broad possession of it and action in accordance with it entrenches the injustice. So it's going to be, so when we're thinking about an educational system in a neighborhood, there's going to be meanings of race and meanings of indigeneity or who are the migrants and such like this that are going to be partly explanatory of our responses. What neighborhoods we're willing to give money to, what neighborhoods we're willing to visit, these sorts of things. And so the cultural meaning of the signals and signs, etc., of what's going on in these neighborhoods are going to be important in understanding what policies we have, what individual responses we have, and they will very much entrench social stratification. Okay, so let's consider the concept of a family, stepping back from the school, etc. Because we process certain kinds of information mainly for the purpose of coordination, we can judge the adequacy of how we do so by reference to how well the coordination works. Better and worse concepts of family can be evaluated in terms of how having the relevant dispositions to respond to a particular content enables us to achieve coordination around intimacy, child-rearing, and economic collaboration. So those are three of the most important things over history and looking at anthropology that families do. They enable intimacy, especially sexual intimacy. There are contexts of child-rearing and contexts of economic collaboration because you need economic collaboration to support children. And so one of the things that we do when we're considering family, so we've got all these families, the partition of logical space, and historically they were all biological families, right? And they were all heteronormative families. Those were the families, right? Those were the families. More cross-generational, but those were the families. But now we're trying to see, okay, does that partition of logical space serve the function of helping us have the right responses to intimacy, child-rearing, and economic collaboration? No, because we need to change the content to include same-sex families and adoptive families. So here, when we're taking the concept to be what is enabling us to, our orientation is this capacity to interact with each other, make certain assumptions, recognize certain things as families, and we're stuck on heteronormative biological families, there's something that starts to go wrong with our coordination. And so we need to semantically adjust. And in the moral context, the organization of family life is a matter of justice. Should we count as real families only those constituted by heterosexual couples and their biological offspring? Our concept of family can be evaluated with respect to whether it facilitates coordination on morally acceptable terms. So in my view, the old conception of family doesn't. There's a moral imperative that we have to include new couples and new families in the concept of family. But of course, in the informational content, in the content of what it is to be a family, but of course this is very contentious. So note that the partition of logical space that we should be collectively tracking and how we track it may be very different from the one we're currently tracking. This provides a basis for allowing ameliorative accounts to be a way of improving the content of our concepts by changing the content and not just replacing them. Okay, so in conclusion, I've done all right. We have an interest in carving logical space in order to coordinate with each other, to draw distinctions that serve our purposes as social beings and to realize our values. How best to do this changes as we develop new technologies and as we come to appreciate new and different values. When social change happens, there's likely to be controversy and disagreement about how to extend the concepts we've been using to do the work we now need them to do. Such changes should be acknowledged as such and should not be held hostage to what we have thought we were doing all along. So I don't think that we should hold our understanding of marriage to be responsible to, well, all along this is what marriage was, or all along this is what race was, or things like that. We shouldn't be held hostage to that. Our conceptual framework should be forward-looking and give us the tools to envision and create better lives together. Thank you.
Thank you, that was great. Thank you very much. So here's my question. How should the project of semantic amelioration handle conflict?
Yeah.
That is, in all the examples, mostly the examples in this kind of discussion are really nice. So, we ameliorate the concept of family, and then we become morally better in so doing, and we ameliorate the concept of marriage, and we become morally better in so doing. But sometimes the societies are, fragmented, and different groups attempt to ameliorate on this sort of, what's the word, functional grounds.
Yes.
By changing the dispositions exactly the way you described that phenomenon. It's just that then very crucial concepts, let's say freedom, democracy, and so on, really triggered very different dispositions. And so how are we to deal with this conflict from the point of view of your proposal of semantic amelioration?
Yeah, no, this is a beautiful question, and this is something I'm working on right now. So I'm working on a book that's called Doing Justice to the Social. It has all these different parts, and the last part of it is the normative part about, what are the normative considerations and how do we deal with disagreement and conflict about this, and I think it's very difficult. A lot of it is epistemic as well. So, part of it is going to be disagreement over the moral considerations and disagreement over the, how we want to live together and what are the terms of coordination under which we're willing to participate together. And so I think that there's a lot of moral epistemology that's important here. And the model I have for it at the moment, there's no blackboard, is there? No, that's okay. The model I have for it at the moment is that, so we live under conditions of ideology, and that means that many of us are embedded in these practices and see nothing wrong with them, because that's what social reproduction requires, is that we're socialized to continue participating in these practices, because that's how society remains homeostatic. It keeps itself going. And so some of those practices are very problematic, but we hardly notice it because we're so fluent in the social practices that we don't even notice them. But there are going to be groups of people, both on the left and the right and the middle and everything, who begin to notice that there's something going wrong, right? That they have what Iris Young calls a desiring negation. I'm not going to do this anymore. This is unacceptable to me. And sometimes they won't do it because it's harmful to them, or sometimes they won't do it because they see it's harmful to someone they love or care about. So my view is that we then have to form, in effect, counterpublics, to form new languages and new vocabularies and try to rethink the terms that we're talking about. So sometimes we invent new terms like sexual harassment or epistemic injustice or these sorts of things. Sometimes we think, so think of the example of rape, where for many thousands of years, there was no such thing as rape in marriage. And you form a counterpublic, and you say, which is really just a feminist consciousness raising group, and you say, oh, my husband does this to me and I hate it, I can't stand it, I feel like I'm being raped. And then you begin to extend the concept and you begin to use it differently. But that is going to be in these small knowledge communities. You think about a small counterpublics. And so what you need to do then is to develop a constituency of people who can begin to sort of appreciate the critique. But of course, the right does that as well. In the United States, they're doing it just as, the neo-Nazis are doing it, and the Tea Party is doing it, and the Trump supporters are doing it. So what I'm trying to develop is a a sequence of steps. So there's two questions as I see it. One is the problem of illumination. How do you convince other people that your way of doing it is better? And I don't think that reason and argument is going to ever accomplish that, because we know reason and argument is weak. It only really is effective for people who are, thoughtful. And not all the people are thoughtful. So you have to set that aside for the moment, because I think that you need to do that through collective, strikes and demonstrations and taking charge of power. Grabbing power and using power. But that's illumination. But in order to do that, I think you need to have some basis for some justification for your views. And so what I want to do is I think, well, in many cases, these critiques on both sides have empirical presuppositions. So the first thing you need to do is look at the empirical presuppositions. So in the case of the right wing, and at least in the United States, they say immigrants are taking our jobs, or immigrants are this, that, and the other. Well, it's just not true that the immigrants are taking the jobs. If the immigrants come into a community, the economy of the community is improved, et cetera, et cetera. The people who lived there before end up getting better paying jobs. So you first have to vet it for false empirical presuppositions, and if you're okay, and that takes science. I'm a feminist empiricist to that extent. But then there are going to be points when you have sort of what are sometimes called fundamental moral disagreements, where you have deep values that are in conflict. And then I think that what's going to have to happen is that you attempt to have conversations in mixed knowledge communities. These may be elite communities, but it may not be elite communities, and you try to do that. But that might not work either. And then I think what happens is if you have a basis for critique and you are saying, I will not put up with this anymore, then you sit down and don't do it anymore. And then the question is, how do we form a new polity, a new community that is going to be non-coercive? And so this is what they did in the civil rights movement, right? And you have a question of, are you going to continue blasting them with fire hoses and dogs, or are you going to change things? And I think it's a very tricky moment, because like in Hong Kong, this is what they're doing. They're saying, we're not going to do this. We're not going to put up with it. And there's that moment where you're either going to be destroyed, literally, wiped out, or there's going to be a readjustment. And so then the issue becomes political, and sort of how do you gain power to make your claim, and how do you live together cooperatively? And so it's I think at that point there's a kind of obligation. So at the deepest part of, I think my view is coercion within a system of cooperation is immoral. And you've got to either split so that you're not in the same system of cooperation anymore, or you've got to do something other than coercion.
Sarah?
That was long, I'm sorry, but I'm working on it, and so I'm really invested in it, and I think it's the question. It is the question.
Hi, thanks. That was great. So I agree with a lot of what you've said. I've written quite a lot on the dictionary concepts and conceptions and so on. I want to push a bit on the idea that the concept remains the same when you have a different partition of space.
Sure.
Because it seems to me there's two different things going on, two different things that you want and their intention.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'd like to see if that's cleared up. So, for instance, you say it's plausible that in the past the informational content of race included only those who met certain biological conditions. And it looks to me as if in that claim it's something like a received view or communal conception that's determining the content.
Mm-hmm.
And what I'd like to see is a distinction between the views that you have, as it were, sort of conceptions, communal conceptions, individual conceptions, and the content. Because as you say later on, you can, your access to the content is mediated, so you can get it wrong.
Yeah.
So once you've got the idea that you can get it wrong, I don't see why you then should also think that it's your views in some sense that are determining the content. So,
Good.
So it looks as if you can say the concept's the same, indeed the partition of space is the same. We just didn't understand where that partition was. So
Yeah,
that's
totally. So I think that that's where I want to say that's what epistemic amelioration is. Yeah, and you wanted that, yeah. And so in the case, so here's the example that I'm working from to try and make sense of semantic. And so in the case of race, I think I'm inclined to agree with you that it was social all along, and that's we were mistaken about the biological stuff. So I think many of them are like that. But so here's the issue. So I think I'm something of a holist when it comes to content, and marriage is the example I like to think of. So marriage is hooked in with all of these other concepts, normative, some of them, and other kinds of, with family and with this and with that and the other. And it carries a kind of weight in our conceptual scheme because it brings all these other concepts and values with it, because of how those dispositions are interconnected. So when marriage equality was being debated in the counterpublic of people supporting LGBTQ movements, there was this controversy. Do we go for civil unions and try and get rid of marriage, or do we try to have marriage equality? I was on the view, get rid of marriage, just have civil unions. Marriage is a religious institution, it's a patriarchal institution, just get rid of it. I think I was wrong. The movement decided, no, we're going to change what marriage is. And the reason why that was so powerful, I think, is that there was all of this weight behind the concept of marriage because of how it was embedded in all of these, how it was holistically linked to all of these other concepts. And so the dispositions and the capacities that we had were not just informed by how we used that word, but how we used all these other words as well. And so when it came to trying to decide what are we going to do here, what I'm trying to get at is that the dispositional integrity of that system of marriage, family, children, all of those sorts of things, that I wanted to preserve that and change the extension or the intention, really, of what the partition was. And that would be a way of keeping the concept, in my sense, those capacities, dispositions, the responsiveness, and whatever, in a significant extent, while applying it to new things. Do you see what I'm getting at? So you're applying those dispositions to respect and include, etc., to these new cases, rather than just finding out they were there all along. Does that make any sense?
It does. I disagree, but
I recognize that there's more than one way to go here, and I'm wanting to allow for that. But I'm exploring this way of going because I want to say that those capacities and dispositions, they're not essentially connected to this partition. It's a different partition that we could be responsive in that same way to. But then what happens is people say, yeah, but the dispositions switch. The dispositions really change. And I'm going, yeah, but they don't change essentially. Anyway, we could talk.
Yeah, I think I agree on that. I don't think it's the dispositions that are changing. I think our view has changed in some way because we recognise actually that there was no moral difference in the same-sex marriages as there are in the from the marriages.
Yeah.
And I think that's a moral recognition of a partition that was really there anyway.
Yeah, see, this is where I think it wasn't there anyway. I mean, it wasn't there before. I think that it was. But that's a good question of how do we decide? And there's a case where I want to say it's a matter of judge. I don't have a principle or a rule for how to make that judgment. But looking at the history of marriage, I'm inclined to say it wasn't there. It wasn't really there. Our whole mode of engagement was constructed around bio-heteronormativity, and And it was unrealistic to think that it wasn't. But it then we've taken all of that responsiveness, and now we've moved it to this. And if you think the concept is that responsiveness, then its content has changed. Anyway. Yeah, anyway.
I'm afraid we will not have time for replies. Sorry.
Oh, sorry.
Because we have no problem. No, it's fine. One reply. We have time for one reply. This one. No more replies. So, please.
Thank you very much. A tiny comment about your discussion of family and then the proper question. Simply to say that I felt you granted a bit too much to the traditional understanding, because of course it was always part of that we could have single dad or single mom families if one of the partners died. So I think that the old concept, as it were, was broader already, which helps the amelioration project. That's it. That's just a small thing. My question was really about your treatment of logical space. I wanted to ask you, am I right in thinking that you're a realist about logical space? And if so, are you a realist also in the sense of logical space being somehow given independently of concepts, or prior to the concepts, or prior to the orientation? And if so, are you also a realist about the partitioning of it, of the logical space? I am sympathetic to realism here, but I just wanted to make sure that I was understanding you right.
Thank you. So it's true on the, I think you're right that there were single parents, but it was assumed that the parents were biological, that there was a biological father and biological mother, that they were in the background, and even if one died, etc. I think another set of interesting cases is there's always been LGBTQ counterpublics where marriage and such has really been different. And so I'm mainly talking about the dominant frame of understanding marriage and family, because we all have had chosen family. Chosen families are part of counterpublics. About the realism, well, I do think that this is a model that is useful. I don't think I really have to take a stand entirely on the metaphysical reality or unreality of it. I mean, I am disposed to think of it in a realist way, but I'm just using the model, and it's kind of like, if the meta-ethicists want to talk about the reality or unreality of value, fine, let them talk about it. And it's the same if the metaphysicians want to worry about the reality or unreality of logical space, let them. I don't think I need to.
Thanks for your talk. My question might be slightly naive, but I'm sort of wondering about, basically the intersection of two problems. First of all, it's sort of like, how do you identify objects, or can you give... it seems that on the one hand, you sort of identify it with an intention of partitioning sort of logical space, maybe conceptual space, because you think maybe about it in terms of like it being in a space, for instance, water being in a space of beverages. But then I'm sort of wondering about if you want to say that concepts change over time, how this sort of relates just to the question of sort of diachronic identity. Like how does the concept stay the same while also undergoing change? Does that mean that the partition changes, or does it just mean that the disposition changes? So for instance, that there are different ways of accessing it, as with the meter example that you gave. Basically that there is a sort of new mode of presentation of the concept. That's sort of what you're getting at.
So I'm a little confused if the question is about persistence or what. So let's see. So in the case of epistemic amelioration, the partition is given and stays stable, and our dispositions and capacities to access it change. Right. And I think that I think that in that case, there's a kind of change in our orientation, but it's not an alteration of our orientation. So I believe I'm an endurantist about everything, and so I don't think that an alteration in our orientation means that one orientation goes out of existence and another orientation comes into existence. So there's that case. In the case of semantic, I think that what we've got is a change in the orientation also, but the change is a change in the related content of the orientation, right? And so where it was one partition of logical space before, it's another partition of logical space. So what happens is the orientation again alters slightly, it continues, but what I'm trying to suggest is that the orientation and the content can kind of go in different ways, so that the orientation is slightly altering but continuing to exist. So the concept continues, to exist. It's the same concept, but the content is shifting. And so I don't. And what the thing about how content is not essential to the concept, insofar as the concept is this kind of broad set of dispositions and information processing capacities and such like that, that can continue even though we change what the content is.
Right, so what then sort of safeguards the identity is rather that there is a continuity of dispositions and...
Right,
okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, and that's tricky. I mean, I don't have a rule here for, what's essential to the set of dispositions for each concept, but I think that we're going to have to look at it, and it's going to depend on the circumstances, because there are going to be times when we've changed it so much that just, but that's a problem for physical objects too, right? Yeah.
Okay, now, Jesus, this is the last question I have taken, so if there's any other question, I'm happy to take it.
Thank you. My question has become a kind of follow-up to that one. Because if concepts are not individuated by their content, but by the dispositions that we have, I have a problem that is that when we try to ameliorate the concepts, we are trying to change the dispositions. So it does not seem so clear to me why we're insisting so much on keeping the concept and ameliorating the concept instead of changing it. If concept is individuated by the dispositions and we're trying to change the dispositions.
Well, we're not changing them essentially.
But we're trying to make essential changes in the disposition.
No, I don't think so. I think in the case of marriage, one of the things that I didn't like about marriage equality was that I think that valorizing lifelong, sexual partnerships is not the best way to go. I think that there should be, I think there are lots of other ways to be a sexual being and to live amongst others and to have a certain kind of the reign of coupledom, is like, oh my God, single people have such a hard time living in a world of couples, right? Because people don't know what to do with them, they don't invite them to their parties, all this kind of stuff. And people, why not have, polyamorous people or all kinds of, there are many ways to live a sexual life other than marriage. Right? So the idea is, I think what happened is that you say, okay, all that stuff, all the value and the valorization and the sort of glorification of this particular mode of forming families and sexual partnerships, that was pretty consistent, and now we just add same-sex people, and they get all the goodies that the heteronormative people got. Seems to me a lot of the dispositions are the same. What some of us are looking for is a world where, no, we don't think that's the only way to live a good life. And that's not the only way to live a good sexual life. That's not the only way to parent. Why on earth do you have to have... So do you know, in the United States, when you want to adopt children, and you have... I'm sorry, I get a little passionate about this. It's not about you. It's about...
That's fine.
It's
the Mediterranean.
Okay. So it's, when you want to adopt children, you have to have a social worker come to your house and talk to you about your sex life. And you're thinking, we're adopting a child. We are committed to living together. what difference does it make how often we have sex, right? But this whole model that, right, it's about sexual intimacy, you can't also, if you don't, I mean, I have friends who live together, they're partners, and they live together, they don't have a shared bank account. They can't adopt a child, right? And you think, oh my God, right? Because the model of family is this bio-heteronormative sexual economic institution that is controlling who gets to grow up in a meaningful, loving situation and who spends their lives in orphanages, right? So anyway, I'm a little bit intense about this, but I think that the model of bionormative, heteronormative coupling and families is completely entrenched. And it still continues just because we allow the people who are in it to be of the same sex. I want to say, screw it all, right? We need to get beyond it. And so I think the dispositions haven't changed very much at all.
But sorry, there are three more questions. There are three more questions.
No, but when we... Yeah, no, eventually we're going to change it, but we're going to get rid of marriage eventually. That's what I think. Right now, we've just ameliorated marriage, but eventually we're going to get rid of it.
You have to refrain, because it was...
Right. Thanks so much for the talk. I guess my question is kind of related to questions. So I was thinking about dispositionism. Yesterday we had a talk about in-between belief cases, and that goes very well with dispositionism. And I was thinking, okay, good, we have dispositionism. There might be cases of in-between concepts as well, right? And at that point I started thinking about my parents. Southern Italy, left wing, my dad is in his 70s, my mom is a little bit younger, left wing, but still, kind of influenced by Catholic educations and so forth. So I was thinking they might have an in-between concept of marriage, right? So they have some dispositions and some others they don't.
Yeah.
Right. So your view is I guess, is supposed to allow for those cases, and it seems to me that in precisely those cases, perhaps the most effective thing to do would be to point to the good dispositions that they have and to get rid of the bad ones. And that would be a kind of amelioration which is neither semantic, I would say, nor epistemic. Maybe we could have something to be said about the epistemic kind of amelioration, but certainly that would not be semantic. So if you could comment on my parents as well.
Yeah, I have family like this too, and I'm in some of my own experience, some of it. No, I think that's really interesting. I don't have a lot to say except that I like the idea of the in-between and trying to push them, and I think it will. And I think that societies can be kind of in between, right? We're not kind of coherent in what we're doing at the moment. We're sort of doing a bit of it all. So I think, for example, on gender, I think in the US anyway, who's a woman, who's a man, there's a kind of, oh my God, we're in a period of chaos about, not everyone, but there's generally a sense of chaos of who counts as a woman and who counts as a man. And whether we are semantically or epistemically ameliorating, it's not really clear at this point. And I just want to accept that is a phenomenon without and wanting to think about it some more.
So, Marco?
Thanks a lot. I share the intuition that words and concepts matter. So it's better politically if we can manage to achieve certain goals while preserving the same concepts and words while changing the content, but not the words of the concept. So I was wondering what you think about an alternative metasemantic story that maybe reduces the amelioration to a purely epistemic of an epistemic kind. There is like workings, interpretivism. So I think it's a sort of, so it would be a metasemantic story that allows us to say that the target content, the one that we prefer politically, was there all along. And the way he achieves that result is basically a sort of reference magnetism. So it's externalistic, probably in an even more robust sense than the one you employ here. And it would, once there's a practice of using or applying the word concept, and there are possible magnets, and the reference magnet that wins is the one that best fits and justifies the practice of using the concept.
Yeah. So that's connected. So the Laura Schroeder has this in her jazz model of meaning, and that you have to, when you make the changes, you are rationally required to say that this was what it was all along. I mean, I think part of the problem I have is that I'm not a believer in reference magnetism, and part of it is because the social domain, the boundaries between kinds are not like the boundaries between kinds in the natural domain, and so I don't think that they're there waiting for us to pick them out. I mean, someone could say, well, maybe they are because they're these moral kinds or whatever, but I think that our activities are creating things in the world that may or may not, so how to think about the kind that we were talking about all along. We create new things and new values and new ways of responding as we go, and the thought that it would be that way all along makes no sense to me. I don't know if this makes any, if I'm being clear.
So in terms of intention, there is you wait.
So it should be very, very short.
Right. So one would think there are already all these partitions. It's just the fact that we pick out one partition rather than the other depends on the use, together with, in this case, what works as a magnet is the fact that it helps us achieve certain political goals.
Yes, but I do think that temporally we're embedded in time, and so there's going to be a variety of partitions that are potential contents for our meaning, I mean, for our concepts, right, and our words and such like this. And it seems to me that part of what I'm getting at is that we have a best guess of what the right partition is, to go along with this practice, but it may turn out to be that, well, that goes more epistemic, doesn't it?
Marta, did you have a question? Or?
Sorry, let me think about it, because but I think I would want to say that I don't like interpretivism. I don't like I don't like reference magnetism. I think it's spooky and bizarre. And how would you possibly make it work? It's just plugging a hole, with a word without having anything like, a real theory. That's all. I just hate it. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is, I don't think it's rationally required of us to think that this is what we meant all along. I think that it's not. We get to mean new things because it's us who are determining the meanings and not our past. So for those reasons, I don't like the view, but I don't yet have an adequate response.
Okay, I think we should leave it here, and thank again Sally Haslanger for the wonderful talk.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you for your questions. It was really helpful.